The first whisper didn't rise from the quarters or drift through the cotton rows the way gossip usually did. It slid out of the big house on a breath of heat, carried by nothing more than a half-open parlor window and a servant who lingered too long before stepping back into the sun. By the time dawn thinned the night, the whisper had learned to walk. But wait for a second before we continue towards the video. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe. By noon, it had learned to wound. Mississippi did not hear it all at once. It came in pieces, fragments, caught at wells, murmured between fence posts, pressed into the dirt with the heel of a boot. Something had gone wrong in the Caldwell house, something that did not fit the shape of ordinary scandal, something that made men pause mid-sentence and women glance over their shoulders before finishing a thought. They said a slave had crossed a line, not struck a master, not run north, not raised a blade. Worse, they said he had touched what was never meant to be touched, had left behind proof that could not be whipped away. They said the house with the white columns had cracked from the inside, and the crack had a name. Elias had been born on the Caldwell plantation, tall by the time he was 15, broad-shouldered by 20, with a stillness that made overseers uneasy. He did not fidget. He did not hurry. He did not ask questions. When spoken to, he listened as if the words mattered, and when dismissed, he left without the usual relief that came with escape. Men noticed that kind of calm. They mistook it for obedience. He had been trusted with errands that brought him close to the big house, carrying ledgers from the study to the smokehouse office, fetching water when the kitchen grew short-handed, holding doors when deliveries arrived from town. He knew which floorboards groaned and which ones did not. He knew the sound of the master's boots compared to the lighter tread of the mistress. He knew the smell of ink and soap and polished wood. That trust grew the summer the mistress fell ill. Mrs. Caldwell had taken to her bed when the heat became unbearable. What began as faintness turned into days of weakness, then weeks. Doctors came and went, offering tonics and instructions that contradicted one another. Curtains were drawn. Lamps burned at odd hours. The house slowed its breath to match hers. Servants were rotated through the sick room, but Elias was kept. He was patient, they said. He moved quietly. He did not stare. He brought water and took away soiled cloths, stood when told, left when dismissed. At first, illness thins the walls between people. Words are spoken softer, then closer. A hand rests longer than it should on a sleeve. A question is asked twice, not for the answer but for the sound of it. Elias learned to look at the floor, then learned that sometimes he was told to look up. Nothing happened all at once. It never does. What happened grew in the spaces where no one was watching, where no one would later admit they should have been. Elias did not seek the mistress's gaze, but he did not always escape it. He did not touch unless told. He did not stay unless commanded. That was the truth as he would later speak it, measured and careful, shaped by a lifetime of knowing what words could cost. Clara returned from Natchez in late June, restless and sharper than she had been the year before. She had grown into herself there, away from the plantation's habits, and the return did not suit her. She walked the halls as if testing them, her steps quick, her voice carrying. She noticed the changes in her mother's room, the drawn curtains, the constant presence of the same servant, the way that servant looked away when spoken to by anyone else. Clara noticed Elias. She watched him the way some people watch storms, with a mixture of fascination and challenge. She asked him questions. He was not meant to answer and laughed when he remained silent. She stood too close. She lingered in doorways. When her mother slept, Clara spoke freely, filling the room with words that did not expect replies. On a Sunday after church, the master rode to town and did not return before nightfall. The sky darkened early, clouds stacking low and heavy. Thunder pressed against the fields like a held breath. Lamps were lit sooner than usual. The house took on a hush that was not sleep. No one would ever say exactly what happened that night. Not then. Not later. Not with a rope nearby or a Bible open on the table. What could be said was this: 2 women woke the next morning with knowledge they had not planned to carry, and 1 man woke knowing that whatever he said, whatever he did, would never be enough. Time passed the way it always does when people want it not to, slowly at first, then all at once. The mistress's gowns were altered. A seamstress was paid extra to ask no questions. Clara took to staying indoors, complaining of the heat. A midwife came in secret, entering through the back gate at dawn and leaving before the sun stood high enough to betray her. Silence was purchased with silver and with fear, but silence has a way of leaking. It leaked when the master noticed the changes and demanded answers. It leaked when the doctor's visits grew more frequent and his looks more guarded. It leaked when Clara could no longer hide what her body declared. The truth arrived in stages, each one heavier than the last. The master learned first of his wife. The house shook with his anger. Furniture overturned, voices raised. He raged at servants who knew nothing and accused those who dared to stand still. Before the day could end, the second truth forced its way forward. The daughter. The proof. The same name attached to both confessions. The yard filled by noon. Overseers stood stiff, their authority uncertain. Hands paused mid-task. Work stopped not by order but by instinct. When Elias was called forward, he stepped into the sun without stumbling, without looking around for mercy that would not come. He listened to the accusations as if they were weather reports. When asked to speak, he chose his words like stones across deep water. "I did not force," he said. "I did not deceive." The crowd shifted. Some wanted denial. Some wanted confession. What they got unsettled them more than either. That was enough. Enough to confirm guilt in minds that had already decided. Enough to justify what would follow. The master raised his voice to pronounce punishment, his words sharp with certainty, with the relief of having somewhere to put his rage. That was when the rider appeared at the gate, horse lathered, hat pulled low, carrying news that would bend the day into something no one could have prepared for, and turn a private disgrace into a story the state would never forget. The rider did not shout when he reached the gate. He did not need to. The way his horse slowed, the way he leaned forward in the saddle as if the weight he carried were heavier than his body, was enough to quiet the yard. Even the master's voice faltered, cutting off mid-syllable. Hanging unfinished in the air, dust clung to the rider's boots and streaked his coat. He pulled his hat free and held it against his chest, not out of respect, but habit. His eyes went first to the master, then, briefly, unmistakably, to Elias standing alone in the sun. "I beg your pardon, sir," the rider said, breath still uneven. "I was told to find you at once." The master bristled at the interruption, his anger already spent once and eager to be spent again. "You see what's happening here," he snapped. "Speak or ride on." The rider swallowed. "It's about the land, sir, the Caldwell tract. There's been a petition filed in Jackson. Questions about the southern boundary and the deed passed down from your father. They're sending an examiner, soon." The yard shifted. Not the slaves, who were used to standing still, but the overseers, the white men who understood at once what that meant. Land disputes did not come quietly. They came with papers, with questions, with eyes that looked too closely at everything else they found along the way. The master's face changed. Rage did not leave him, but it was joined by calculation. He turned the words over in his mind, measuring the risk they carried. Public punishment was spectacle. Spectacle drew attention. Attention invited scrutiny, and scrutiny was dangerous when men from the state were about to arrive with ledgers and seals. "How soon?" he demanded. "Within the week, sir, maybe sooner." The master's gaze slid back to Elias, then to the gathered crowd. He could feel the moment slipping from him, the clean finality of violence replaced by delay. Delay was intolerable, but necessity had a way of humbling even the proudest men. "Take him," he said at last, his voice colder, now flatter. "Lock him away. He'll answer for this, but not here, not today." The order rippled outward. Chains were brought. Elias did not resist as iron closed around his wrists. He did not look at the women watching from the porch, though he could feel their eyes on him. He walked when pushed, steady, careful with his footing, as if each step mattered. The yard slowly returned to motion, though nothing felt the same. Work resumed without rhythm. Hands moved, but mind stayed fixed on what had been said and what had not. The rider dismounted and was led inside, already being questioned about dates and names, about who might come and what authority they would carry. Inside the house, the air was thick with fear. Mrs. Caldwell lay back against her pillows, pale and trembling. She had heard enough to know that whatever protection secrecy had offered was gone. Clara stood near the window, arms folded tight against her body, her jaw set in a way that looked like defiance, but felt more like panic. "They know," Clara said quietly. "They're going to know everything." "No," her mother whispered. "They can't. They won't ask about that. It's not their concern." But she did not believe it. Neither did Clara. Men who came to examine land did not stop at fences. They asked about labor, about boundaries marked by memory instead of stone. They asked about births and deaths, about transfers and sales. They noticed what others pretended not to see. Down in the storage room beneath the smokehouse, Elias was pushed into darkness. The door closed with a sound that echoed longer than it should have. He stood still until his eyes adjusted, until he could make out the shapes of old crates and rusted tools. The chains bit into his wrists when he moved, a reminder that stillness was now enforced. Time stretched. He counted breaths, then stopped counting. He listened to the plantation settle into its uneasy afternoon. Somewhere above him, life continued. Somewhere else, decisions were being made that would shape the rest of his days. When footsteps finally approached, he straightened. He expected an overseer. What he got was the preacher. The man was older than Elias had expected, his hair thin and gray, his coat worn at the cuffs. He carried a Bible under one arm and a lantern in the other. He did not look angry, he looked tired. "They asked me to speak with you," the preacher said, setting the lantern down so its light fell between them. "To hear your confession." Elias met his gaze without flinching. "I've already spoken." "They want more," the preacher replied. "They always do." Silence settled between them, not hostile but heavy. The preacher waited. Elias did not rush. When he spoke, it was with care. "I did not force," he said again. "I did not deceive." The preacher studied him, his eyes narrowing not with suspicion but with thought. "And did you consent?" Elias hesitated just long enough for the question to land the way it was meant to. "Consent," he repeated softly. "Is that a word you use for me?" The preacher looked away. Above them the master paced his study, papers spread across the desk, his anger now a low burn instead of a blaze. He sent messengers to town, summoned advisors, instructed servants to say nothing, to remember nothing. He framed the delay as mercy, as order, as propriety. He told himself he would deal with Elias later, once the danger had passed, but danger had a way of multiplying. Word spread beyond the plantation by nightfall. Not the full truth, never that, but enough. Enough to invite curiosity, enough to invite judgment, enough to ensure that when the state men arrived, they would arrive alert. Elias remained locked away, alive but suspended. His fate paused like a blade held just above skin. The delay did not feel like reprieve. It felt like being made to wait for a storm already visible on the horizon. The storage room did not grow darker when the door closed behind the preacher. The lantern's flame stayed steady, throwing long shadows that crept up the walls and clung there, unmoving. Elias sat with his back against a crate, chains loose enough now to rest heavy in his lap. He did not watch the preacher pace or thumb the thin pages of his Bible. He watched the light, the way it bent around the iron ring set into the floor decades earlier, before he had been born. The preacher cleared his throat. "They expect words from you," he said, "words that fit." Elias did not answer at once. Silence had always been his shield. But the question the preacher had asked, about consent, still hung in the air, refusing to settle. He drew a breath that felt older than his body. "They don't want words," he said finally. "They want an ending." The preacher nodded, as if this confirmed something he had suspected but not named. He set the Bible down and sat on an overturned barrel, close enough now that Elias could see the fine cracks in his hands, the scars of a life that had also learned restraint. "Tell me," the preacher said, softer, "what ending would be true?" Elias lifted his head. For a moment the habit of caution nearly won. Years of knowing how truth could be twisted pressed against his tongue. But there was something in the preacher's eyes, weariness perhaps, or the simple fact that he had not yet decided who Elias was allowed to be. "They say I took," Elias began. "They don't ask how I was placed where I could be taken from." The preacher did not interrupt. "When the mistress fell ill," Elias continued, "I was sent because I was quiet, because I did not look where I was not told. That changed. She spoke to me at night when others were gone. She told me I was needed, that without me she would not live through the summer." He paused. His hands tightened against the chains, metal biting into skin. "When she touched me, I froze. I thought if I didn't move, if I didn't respond, it would pass. It didn't. She said if I spoke, if I pulled away, she would say I attacked her. She said, who would they believe?" The preacher's breath caught, almost soundless. Later, Elias said, "Her daughter watched. She learned. She used different words, sharper ones. She said if I did not come when she called, she would scream and say I forced my way in. She laughed when she said it. She liked that I couldn't leave." The lantern flame flickered, though there was no breeze. The preacher leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his Bible forgotten. "Why didn't you run?" he asked, and even as the words left him, he knew how small they sounded. Elias gave a humorless smile. "Run where, and leave them free to say what they wanted? Run and become proof of what they already believed?" The preacher closed his eyes. He had preached obedience all his life. He had told men like Elias that endurance was virtue, that suffering would be accounted for elsewhere. Sitting here, he felt the weight of those words like stones in his pockets. "And the child," the preacher said quietly. "The children. I don't know." "Which are mine," Elias said. "They will never ask. They will decide." Above them, the plantation settled into night. Crickets began their song. Somewhere in the big house, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing ahead to questions she did not know how to answer. Mrs. Caldwell wept into her pillow, grief tangled with fear, her body betraying her even as she clung to the last scraps of control she had known. In the study, The master poured himself another drink and stared at the land deed spread before him. The writer's news had not left his thoughts. He imagined state men walking the fence lines, peering into account books, listening too closely to servants emboldened by the scent of scandal. He imagined what would happen if Elias were killed now, how the act would echo, how it might be read not as justice but as concealment. Delay, he told himself again. Delay was strategy. The preacher returned his attention to Elias. If I speak of this, he said slowly, it will not be as they expect. It will not be safe. Elias met his gaze. It's never safe. The preacher stood, pacing now, the lantern casting his shadow in fragments. They'll say you're lying, he said. They'll say I've been deceived. They'll say worse. They already say worse, Elias replied. Silence stretched again, different this time. It carried decision in it. The preacher stopped pacing. He picked up his Bible, ran a hand over its worn cover. I was asked to hear a confession, he said. What I heard was testimony. Elias did not react. Hope was a luxury he had learned to ration. I can't promise you anything, the preacher went on, but I can promise you this, I won't repeat their story as if it were the only one. He lifted the lantern. The light swung, briefly illuminating the old iron rings again, the scratches on the floor left by men who had once been kept here and then erased from memory. If they ask, the preacher said, I will say what I know, and what I know is that power does not always wear chains. Elias nodded once. It was not gratitude exactly. It was acknowledgement. When the door opened, night rushed in, cooler air slipping around the lantern's glow. The preacher paused on the threshold, looking back at Elias one last time. There was fear in his eyes now, but also resolve. I will pray, he said. Elias watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. In the darkness that followed, he sat alone with the knowledge that truth had been spoken aloud at last, and that once spoken, it could no longer be entirely contained. Clara woke before dawn with the taste of iron in her mouth and the weight of a decision pressing against her chest. The house was quiet in the way that meant listening, floors holding their breath, walls leaning closer than they should. She lay still, staring at the pale ceiling, tracing the hairline cracks she had known since childhood. They seemed wider this morning, as if the house itself were splitting under the strain of what it carried. She had spent the night turning the preacher's visit over in her mind, though she had not been present for it. News moved differently inside the big house. It seeped through keyholes and under doors, carried by servants who pretended not to hear and heard everything. By midnight, Clara knew the preacher had gone to see Elias. By morning, she knew it mattered. Her mother coughed in the next room, a thin, rasping sound that pulled Clara to her feet. She crossed the threshold quietly and found Mrs. Caldwell propped on pillows, eyes open and glassy, her nightgown damp with sweat. The lamplight caught the lines in her face, the ones illness had carved deeper, and Clara felt a flicker of something, dangerously close to pity. You're awake, her mother said. It was not a question. So are you, Clara replied. She poured water, held the cup, watched her mother drink in small, careful sips. The intimacy of it, daughter serving mother, felt suddenly fragile, a performa. An NCE that might shatter if either of them spoke too plainly. They'll come, Mrs. Caldwell whispered, setting the cup aside. Men with papers, men who ask questions. They always do, Clara said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Mrs. Caldwell's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. You must be careful what you say. The words struck Clara harder than any accusation. Careful, as if care had ever been an option, as if the choices had not been made long before she understood their cost. She felt heat rise in her chest, a burn she had spent months containing. What I say, Clara repeated. What about what you did? The room went still. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes flicked to the door, then back. Lower your voice, she hissed. You don't understand. I understand enough, Clara cut in. I understand that you told me silence was protection, that you told me what would happen if I spoke, that you told me he would be blamed and I would be saved. Mrs. Caldwell turned her face away. It was necessary. For whom? Clara demanded. The question hung there unanswered. Downstairs, the house began to wake. Footsteps creaked. Doors opened and closed. Somewhere the master's voice rose, sharp and impatient, already rehearsing authority. Clara felt the day gathering itself like a storm. After breakfast, an affair eaten in fragments, no one lingering, Clara retreated to her room. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple gown, one she might have worn to church. The act felt symbolic, though she could not have said why. She braided her hair, hands steady, and pinned it back. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. There was fear there, yes, but also something else, something harder. She found her mother again before noon, this time sitting upright, insisting on appearing composed. The master had not yet come to the sick room. Clara suspected he was avoiding it, afraid of what might be said when they were alone. "They'll ask me," Clara said without preamble. "I know they will." Mrs. Caldwell's lips thinned. "You will tell them what we agreed." "What we agreed under threat," Clara replied. "What you taught me to repeat." Her mother's composure cracked. "Do you think they'll spare you?" she whispered fiercely. "Do you think truth will protect you? They will tear you apart, Clara. They will call you names you have never heard. They will say you invited it. They will say worse." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, then recede, replaced by a familiar numbness. "They already think worse," she said. "They think I'm ruined. They think he is a monster. No one thinks I had no choice." Mrs. Caldwell reached for her, then stopped, her hand hovering. "You had choices," she said weakly. Clara laughed once, a sharp sound that surprised them both. "Did I?" she asked. "When you told me what would happen if I refused. When you told me what he could do to us if he spoke. When you told me whose word mattered." The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken things. Miss Caldwell was brought in, supported by a servant, her face pale but determined. The preacher's eyes moved between them, lingering on Clara for a fraction longer than politeness required. It was enough. "We may need to hear from everyone involved," the preacher said carefully. "In due time." The master stiffened. "My daughter is not to be questioned." Clara felt something settle in her then, a clarity that cut through fear like a blade. She stepped forward before she could think better of it. "I will speak," she said. The room froze. Her father stared at her as if she had struck him. Mrs. Caldwell gasped, reaching out instinctively, then stopping herself. "There is nothing for you to say," the master snapped. "There is," Clara replied. Her voice shook now, but she did not stop. "And I will say it." The preacher nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps not here," he said gently. "Perhaps when the inquiry begins." Clara held her father's gaze. She had never seen him look uncertain before. It terrified her and strengthened her resolve. That night, sleep refused to come. Clara lay awake, listening to the house breathe, to the distant sounds of chains being moved as Elias was shifted for the night. The knowledge that he was still alive, still waiting, pressed on her conscience like a weight she could no longer bear. She rose before dawn again and went to her mother's room. Mrs. Caldwell slept fitfully, murmuring words Clara could not make out. Clara stood there a long time, watching the woman who had once been her whole world, now a stranger shaped by fear. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, though she was not sure for what. Then she turned and left. By mid-morning, word had spread that there would be a hearing of sorts, prompted by the land dispute but fueled by the scandal. Church elders would attend, neighbors would come, questions would be asked, whether invited or not. Clara dressed again, hands trembling now despite her resolve. When she reached the parlor, the master was already there, pacing. He stopped when he saw her. "You will not disgrace this family further," he said. Clara met his gaze, feeling the old reflex to shrink, to appease, rise, and then fall away. "The disgrace is already done," she said. "I'm just deciding where it belongs." Outside, chairs were being set, voices gathered. The plantation held its breath as if sensing the moment tipping toward something irreversible. Clara stepped onto the porch beside her father and mother, the sun bright and unforgiving. She scanned the faces below, neighbors, overseers, churchmen, and felt a wave of dizziness. For a moment she thought she might faint. Then she thought of Elias in the dark, of the preacher's conflicted eyes, of the way silence had protected no one but power. She drew a breath and steadied herself. When the time came, she would speak, not because she believed it would save her, not because she trusted the men listening, but because the truth, once spoken, could not be chained. The morning of the hearing arrived with a brightness that felt almost cruel. Sunlight spilled across the yard, illuminating every fence post and window pane, every face drawn by curiosity or duty. Chairs had been arranged in uneven rows near the porch, borrowed from neighbors and the church, their legs sinking slightly into the dirt. Men gathered first, hats in hand, voices low. Women followed in small clusters, whispering behind gloved fingers. The plantation, usually so confident in its routines, felt exposed, as if it had been pulled open for inspection. Clara stood just inside the front doors, listening to the murmur outside. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a reminder that she could still turn back. She pressed her palms together until her fingers ached, grounding herself in the sensation. When she closed her eyes, she saw Elias's face as it had looked the day he was taken, calm, unreadable, already bracing for what he could not escape. She opened her eyes again. The preacher arrived shortly before noon, accompanied by 2 elders from the church. They spoke quietly with the master on the porch, their heads bent together, their expressions grave. The master nodded stiffly, his jaw set, his posture rigid with the effort of control. He had dressed for authority, coat pressed, boots polished, every detail announcing that this was his ground, his domain. Mrs. Caldwell was brought out next, supported by a servant. She looked smaller than Clara remembered, her illness etched into her posture. She took her seat near the front, eyes downcast, hands folded tightly in her lap. Clara felt a flicker of sympathy again, followed by anger. Both emotions coexisted now, neither canceling the other. When Clara stepped onto the porch, a ripple passed through the crowd. Heads turned, conversations stilled. She could feel their eyes on her, weighing her, deciding what kind of story she would fit into. She took a seat beside her mother, her spine straight, her chin lifted. The master shot her a warning look. She did not look back. The preacher cleared his throat and stepped forward. He spoke first of the land dispute, of the need for clarity and order. His words were careful, chosen to frame the gathering as respectable, necessary. Then, slowly, he acknowledged the other matter that had drawn so many to listen. He did not name it outright. He did not need to. Everyone knew. "We are here," he said, "to hear what must be heard so that truth is not buried under fear." A murmur ran through the crowd. The master shifted, preparing to speak, but the preacher raised a hand. "There will be time," he said gently. An elder read from a list, names called forward to speak about boundaries, about work, about matters that skirted the heart of the scandal without touching it. The tension built with each passing minute, coiling tighter. Clara felt it in her chest, a pressure that made breathing difficult. Finally, the preacher turned toward the porch. "There are those most directly affected," he said. "If they wish to speak, they may." Silence followed, long, heavy. Clara could hear her own pulse in her ears. She glanced at her mother, whose face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. The master stared straight ahead, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Clara stood. The movement seemed to break something loose in the air. A few gasps sounded. Someone whispered her name. The master reached out, his hand brushing her sleeve. "Sit down," he hissed. She did not. "I will speak," Clara said, her voice carrying farther than she expected. She stepped forward until she stood at the edge of the porch, facing the crowd. For a moment she faltered. The faces blurred together, a sea of expectation and judgment. She felt suddenly young, exposed. Then she remembered the night she had lain awake, the threats whispered in rooms meant for safety, the way silence had wrapped itself around her like a second skin. She drew a breath. "They say a slave did this to us," she began. The words tasted bitter, heavy with the lies they carried. "They say he took what was not his, that he forced himself where he did not belong." A murmur rose, quickly hushed. "I will tell you what I know," Clara continued. "Not what I was taught to repeat, not what I was told would keep us safe." Her mother made a small sound, half plea, half protest. Clara did not look at her. "When my mother fell ill," Clara said, "a servant was kept close, not because he was dangerous, because he was quiet, because he did as he was told, because he could be threatened without consequence." The master's face flushed. "This is not appropriate." The preacher held up a hand. "Let her speak." Clara swallowed. Her hands trembled now, but she clasped them together and went on. "He did not choose what happened. We did. My mother did. I did. And when I hesitated, when I wanted to stop, I was reminded of what would happen if I spoke, of who would be believed." The yard had gone utterly still. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent. "I was told," Clara said, her voice breaking at last, "that if I refused, if I told anyone, he would be killed. Or worse, I was told that my word would save me and condemn him, that his word meant nothing." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Someone swore under their breath. Mrs. Caldwell bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. The master stepped forward, his composure shattering. "This is a lie," he shouted. "She's confused. She's been unwell. You see?" Clara turned to face him fully now, her fear eclipsed by something fierce and steady. "You knew," she said. "You knew enough to be angry at him and not at us. You knew enough to threaten and delay. You knew enough to protect what mattered to you." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. The preacher looked between them, his face grave. One of the elders shifted uncomfortably. Clara turned back to the crowd. "I am not asking you to forgive me," she said. "I am telling you what happened. I am telling you that power was used, that silence was forced, that what you believe about this man was shaped by fear and convenience." Her legs felt weak, but she did not sit. She finished in a voice barely above a whisper. "That is the truth." For a moment no one spoke. The sound of a chair scraping against the ground seemed unnaturally loud. Then voices erupted all at once. Questions, denials, shocked exclamations. Some turned on Clara with disbelief, others on the master with suspicion. The neat lines of authority began to blur. "This is madness," the master said, his voice hoarse. "You will not entertain this." But it was too late. The words had been spoken. They could not be pulled back. The preacher raised his voice, calling for order. "Enough," he said. "Enough. This hearing was called to clarify matters, not inflame them. And yet," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "we cannot pretend we have not heard what we have heard." An elder cleared his throat. "If this is true," he said slowly, "it changes the matter." "It does," the preacher agreed. "It does not make it simple, but it changes it." The master laughed harshly. "You would take the word of a girl over mine." The preacher met his gaze. "I would take no word alone," he said, "but I would not dismiss one because it is inconvenient." The crowd buzzed, tension rising, tempers flaring. Some faces held sympathy, others revulsion, many confusion. No one spoke of mercy. They spoke of propriety, of scandal, of what would be said beyond the plantation gates. Through it all, Clara stood, feeling both emptied and exposed. She had expected fear. She had expected anger. She had not expected the strange relief that settled in her chest, the knowledge that whatever came next, she had broken the silence that had bound her. As the preacher finally called the gathering to a close, promising further inquiry, the crowd dispersed slowly, buzzing with speculation. Eyes followed Clara as she stepped back into the house, some curious, some condemning. The master remained on the porch, staring out at the yard as if seeing it for the first time. Inside, Clara sank onto a chair, her strength leaving her all at once. Mrs. Caldwell sat nearby, silent, her face unreadable. No words passed between them. Outside, the plantation did not return to its routines. Men lingered, women whispered. The story had taken on a life of its own, already moving beyond the place where it had been born, and somewhere below, in the dimness of confinement, Elias waited, unaware of the exact words spoken but feeling, in his bones, that something irreversible had begun. By nightfall, the plantation no longer belonged to itself. What had been spoken on the porch traveled faster than the river after rain. It left on borrowed horses and in wagons headed toward town. It rode in the mouths of men who swore they would keep quiet, and women who said, "Tea." Hay would not repeat it, and did both before the sun set. By the time lamps were lit in nearby houses, the story had already begun to change shape. Some said the master's daughter had gone mad. Some said she had been coerced into lying by a preacher hungry for attention. Others whispered that the master himself had lost control of his household long before any slave crossed a line. The details twisted, but one thing remained fixed. The name Elias no longer belonged only to the plantation. It had been released into Mississippi. The master felt it first as absence. Orders given were carried out more slowly. Overseers hesitated before speaking, their confidence dulled by the sense that eyes were now everywhere. Servants who once lowered their gaze now looked through him instead, careful but alert. He told himself this was temporary. That scandal always flared and burned out. That authority, properly asserted, would reassert itself. He sent for Elias that evening, not to see him, but to have him moved. "Not out of here," he said sharply to the overseer. "Not yet, somewhere quiet, somewhere unseen." The overseer hesitated. "Sir," he said, choosing his words, "people are already talking. If something happens to him now—" "If something happens to him," the master snapped, "it will happen on my terms." Still, the overseer understood. Killing Elias now would not silence the story. It would seal it. It would turn rumor into certainty. Mississippi loved nothing more than proof. So Elias remained alive but displaced. Chains were reapplied, tighter this time, and he was moved under cover of darkness to a small outbuilding farther from the house, nearer the edge of the property. The journey was brief but rough. He did not resist. He did not ask where he was being taken. He already understood the logic of it. Visibility was now danger. When the door shut again, Elias found himself alone with new sounds, the distant rush of the river, the cry of night birds, the softer, less familiar rhythm of a place not meant for people. He sat and listened, measuring time by breath and thought. He did not yet know what Clara had said. Egate. He was young, eager, his notebook already creased with use. The overseer turned him away, but not before the man had glimpsed the house, the yard, the air of tension that hung over everything. He left smiling, already composing sentences in his head. The preacher received visits as well. Men he had known for years now came with questions edged in accusation. Had he overstepped? Had he allowed himself to be used? Did he understand the damage his restraint had caused? He answered carefully, aware that every word mattered now. "I heard testimony," he said again and again. "I did not invent it." At night he prayed harder than he had in years, not for forgiveness, but for clarity. He had believed once that truth was a clean thing. Mississippi was teaching him otherwise. The elders convened quietly, away from the plantation. They spoke of propriety, of the danger of allowing such stories to unsettle order. But they also spoke of appearances, of what it would mean if the state men arrived and found a slave dead or vanished without explanation. They agreed on one thing: whatever happened next had to look lawful. That decision, too, traveled. By the third day, strangers passed the plantation road more often than usual. Some slowed to stare, some pretended not to. The master noticed. He hated the way it made his skin crawl. He sent word that Elias would be transferred temporarily for his own protection, a phrase that tasted like ash. Guards were assigned. The plan was to move him at night, quietly, to another holding where he could be kept alive and out of sight, until the inquiry concluded, alive but hunted. Elias learned of the plan when a guard let it slip, careless with his words. "They don't want you dead," the man muttered. "Not yet." Elias nodded. He had already understood that much. Death would have been simpler. Survival in this moment was complicated. On the fourth night they came for him, 2 guards, tense and alert, shackles clinking softly as they secured his wrists and ankles. The moon was thin, the sky clouded just enough to hide them from casual view. They moved quickly, pushing him forward, urging silence. As they passed the edge of the fields, Elias saw torches in the distance. Not close, but closer than they should have been. Voices drifted on the air, indistinct but numerous. He felt a tightening in his chest, a recognition that the story had grown larger than the men escorting him. One of the guards swore under his breath. "We're late," he said. They pressed on. Somewhere behind them, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a horse snorted. The night felt crowded, alive with unseen watchers. Elias kept his footing, his breathing steady. Panic would only slow him down, and speed mattered now. They reached the wagon just as voices grew louder. Shadows moved at the edge of the trees. The guards hesitated, exchanging a glance heavy with calculation. "This is a bad idea," one said. "It's the only one," the other replied. They lifted Elias toward the wagon, chains clanking louder now despite their efforts. The sound carried. A shout rang out, unclear, distant but real. More voices answered. Chaos bloomed. Whether it was coincidence or design, Elias would never know. The wagon lurched as a horse reared. One guard stumbled, cursing. In the confusion, a chain slipped loose. For a heartbeat, everything hung suspended. The torchlight, the shouting, the choice. Elias did not run immediately. He stood, feeling the weight of freedom press against him like a test. He could vanish into the trees. He knew the land well enough. He could become rumor, shadow, proof of guilt in the eyes of those who needed it to be so. Then he thought of the women in the house, of Clara's voice rising over the crowd, of the truth that had finally been spoken, and how easily it could be twisted if he fled. He thought of what his escape would cost them. The guards shouted again, louder now, panic edging their voices. Torches! Drew closer. The moment narrowed. Elias stepped back, hands raised. "I'm here," he said calmly. "I'm not running." The guards froze, stunned by the choice. For a second, the night seemed to hold its breath. Mississippi was watching now, and Elias, alive and still, had just made himself impossible to ignore. The moment Elias lowered his hands, the night seemed to recoil. The guards stared at him as if he had spoken in another language. One of them reached for his weapon, then hesitated, uncertain what threat he was meant to answer. The other swore again, this time under his breath. The sound edged with something like disbelief. Behind them, torches pushed closer through the trees. Voices sharpened, no longer confused but intent, forming questions that did not yet have answers. The air felt tight, crowded with anticipation. "You're a fool," one guard muttered, grabbing Elias's arm. "You had your chance." "I am," Clara replied. He exhaled sharply. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," she said, "more than you think." He turned then, his face drawn, his authority fraying at the edges. "People are circling," he said. "They smell blood, and you've given them reason." Clara met his gaze. "They would have found it anyway." He looked away, jaw tightening. "You think this ends well?" "No," she said honestly. "I think it ends." The state men arrived 2 days later. They came in a pair, riding side by side, their coats clean, their expressions professionally neutral. They introduced themselves with names that carried weight and papers that bore seals. They asked about boundaries first, about the deed passed down from the master's father, about markers that had shifted over time. They asked questions the master could answer easily. Then they asked ones that required explanation. They noticed the extra guards. They noticed the unease. They noticed the way servants hovered nearby, alert in a way that spoke of recent upheaval. Eventually, one of them asked the question that had been circling since the hearing. "And the man," he said, "the one at the center of this disturbance." The master's mouth tightened. "He's being held." "For what charge?" the examiner asked. The master hesitated just long enough to betray himself. "For investigation." The examiner nodded slowly. "We'll want to see him." Elias was brought out into the light, chains gleaming dully. The examiners studied him with the detached interest of men accustomed to measuring human lives against paperwork. They asked his name. They asked how long he had been on the plantation. They asked about his treatment. Elias answered simply, carefully. He did not volunteer details. He did not accuse. He did not recant. Clara watched from the edge of the gathering. Her stomach knotted. She could see the examiner's attention sharpen, not with sympathy, but with interest. Elias was no longer just a problem to be solved. He was a variable. That made him dangerous. By evening, the master understood what was happening. The inquiry had expanded. The examiners asked to speak with Clara privately, then with Mrs. Caldwell, then with the preacher. Each conversation left behind a residue of tension that did not dissipate. The master felt control slipping through his fingers, not dramatically, not in a way that could be named outright, but in the small things, questions unanswered, decisions delayed, authority deferred. He realized then that Elias could not remain on the plantation. Alive, visible, and now spoken to by men of the state, Elias had become a liability too large to manage here. Killing him was no longer an option. Keeping him was worse. That night, the master made a decision. Elias was summoned again, this time without spectacle. He was brought to the study, chains removed, guards stationed discreetly at the door. The master sat behind his desk, the lamplight casting his face into sharp planes. "You will be sold," the master said flatly, "out of state, quietly." Elias did not react. He had expected something like this. Survival always came with displacement. "You will never return here," the master continued. "You will never speak of this place again." Elias met his gaze. "I already have." The master flinched, then recovered. "This is the only way," he said, "for everyone." "For you," Elias replied. The master said nothing more. When Clara learned of the plan, she felt the familiar surge of helplessness followed by resolve. She sought out the preacher, her voice low and urgent. "They're sending him away," she said, "before anything is settled." The preacher closed his eyes briefly. "I feared as much." "Can you stop it?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not without making it worse. The law will not protect him here. It barely acknowledges him." Clara swallowed. Then what good was any of this? The preacher met her gaze. "You spoke truth," he said. "That does not always mean you get justice." The sale happened before dawn. Elias was loaded onto a wagon bound for the river, his destination unspecified, his future narrowed to whatever awaited him beyond the state line. As the wagon rolled away, he looked back once, not at the house, but at the land, the fields he knew by heart. Clara watched from an upstairs window, her chest tight. She did not wave. She did not cry out. She held the moment in silence, knowing that this, too, was part of what surviving required. The wagon disappeared into the morning haze. Mississippi would tell the story many ways after that. Some would say the slave was spared. Some would say he was banished. Some would insist he had been guilty all along and removed to restore order. But those who had seen him stand still when he could have run would remember something else. They would remember a man who refused to become a convenient ending. The wagon did not leave a trail anyone could follow for long. Its wheels cut shallow lines in the dirt that the morning softened and erased. By the time the sun rose fully, the plantation looked much as it always had, fields stretching obediently toward the tree line, the house standing intact. To an untrained eye, nothing had changed. To those who lived there, everything had. Mississippi absorbed the story the way it absorbed heat, slowly, unevenly, storing it until it could no longer be ignored. In the days that followed Elias's removal, the talk did not die. It rearranged itself. Names were softened or sharpened depending on who spoke them. Details shifted. Motives were revised. People remembered only what they needed to remember. The master returned to his routines with a grim determination. He oversaw the fields personally for a time. His presence meant to reassure, to remind. Orders resumed their old cadence. Punishments were measured, public, but restrained. He spoke little of what had happened, and when he did, he framed it as resolution. The trouble had been dealt with. The man had been removed. The inquiry would conclude. Order would return, but order once interrupted never returns in quite the same way. The state men finished their examination and departed with their papers and notes. They found enough irregularities to justify recommendations, not enough to provoke open confrontation. Landlines would be redrawn slightly. Accounts would be adjusted. The master would pay fees and endure a period of scrutiny. Nothing that would ruin him. Enough to bruise. Neighbors came and went. Some offered support, others thinly veiled judgment. Invitations dried up for a season. Smiles were less certain. When the master spoke, people listened. But they listened differently now, alert for cracks. Mrs. Caldwell did not recover as expected. Her illness lingered. complicated by a heaviness that no doctor named. She spent long hours staring out the window, her gaze unfocused. When she spoke, it was often to recall details that no longer mattered, how the house used to sound at night, the way the fields looked before the heat set in. Clara sat with her when she could, reading aloud or simply keeping watch. They did not revisit what had been said. The truth had done its work. There was no putting it back. Clara changed in quieter ways. She moved through the house with a new purpose, less eager to please, less willing to be invisible. She avoided the porch where she had spoken, as if the boards themselves remembered. When neighbors addressed her, she met their eyes and let them look as long as they needed. She did not apologize. Sometimes, late at night, she thought of Elias on the road, the way he had stood still when he could have vanished. She imagined him looking back once, not at the house but at the land. She wondered what kind of courage that took, to refuse the only freedom offered because it would cost others too much. She wondered whether she would have done the same. The preacher continued his work, but his sermons changed. He spoke more often of responsibility than obedience, of truth as burden rather than balm. Some parishioners nodded along, others shifted uncomfortably. A few stopped attending. He accepted this with a weary calm. He had learned that saying, what needed to be said did not guarantee being heard. Elias's name surfaced in places Clara did not expect. She heard it in town, spoken by men who had never set foot on the plantation. She heard it distorted, made smaller or larger depending on the teller. Sometimes he was cast as a villain spared by misplaced mercy, sometimes as a victim removed to keep the peace. Rarely did anyone speak of him as a man who had chosen anything at all. Time passed, seasons turned, the cotton came in and went out, new hands arrived, old ones were sold or died. The plantation endured, altered but standing. Mississippi moved on to other stories, other outrages, other comforts. Years later, Clara left the state. She did not announce it widely. She packed her things, arranged for her mother's care, and boarded a riverboat heading north. As the shoreline receded, she felt a tightening in her chest she had not expected. Mississippi had shaped her, wounded her, given her the language of endurance. Leaving it felt both like escape and betrayal. She carried the story with her, though she did not tell it often. When she did, she was careful. She refused to simplify it for listeners who wanted heroes and villains neatly assigned. She spoke of power, of silence, of the cost of truth. Some listened, others did not. Back home, the master aged into a quieter authority. He remained respected in certain circles, tolerated in others. The scandal never fully faded, but it dulled, becoming something spoken of obliquely, a cautionary tale without a clear moral. When asked about it, he offered brief answers and changed the subject. He did not speak Elias's name again. Mrs. Caldwell died in her sleep one winter morning, the house unusually still. Clara returned for the funeral, standing among neighbors who greeted her with a mixture of familiarity and distance. The preacher spoke words of comfort that hovered just shy of absolution. The master listened without expression. After the burial, Clara walked the grounds alone. She stood at the edge of the fields, the soil cold beneath her boots. For a moment, she imagined Elias there, not as he had been in chains, but as he might have been if choice had ever belonged to him. The thought brought no peace, but it steadied her. Mississippi remembered the story the way it remembered most things, imperfectly, selectively. In some tellings, the slave had been guilty and wisely removed. In others, the daughter's confession had been exaggerated, a fit of nerves. In still others, the truth hovered closer to what had been spoken, though never fully embraced. The details blurred, the ending hardened. What remained consistent was the discomfort, the sense that something had gone wrong in a way that could not be corrected without cost. The recognition, faint but persistent, that the system had been exposed not by violence but by survival. Elias did not return. No letter came bearing his name. No confirmed sighting followed. He became a figure in the margins of memory, a presence felt rather than seen. Some said he had started anew somewhere along the river. Some said he had died young, worn down by labor and distance. Others insisted he had vanished into anonymity, the only freedom available to him. Clara preferred the last version. It allowed for a life not entirely defined by what had been taken. Years later, when she told the story to someone who asked why it mattered, she said this, that a man had once been offered escape and refused it, not because he did not want freedom, but because he understood what his disappearance would permit, that he had chosen to stand where he was and be seen, even when being seen was dangerous, that the shock Mississippi never quite recovered from was not the scandal itself, but the refusal to provide a convenient ending. The land endured. The house weathered storms and repairs. Names changed hands. Mississippi went on telling stories, smoothing their edges, forgetting what did not fit. But somewhere beneath the layers of retelling, the truth persisted, not as a lesson learned, but as a question left unanswered. And that, more than anything, was what Mississippi never forgot.